It's Ivy Slater, and you're listening to Her Success Story podcast, a show where gutsy businesswomen share their success journey. Hi, this is Ivy Slater. Welcome to today's episode of Her Success Story. And welcome to this series we're doing. This is the first time we're doing a series around M&A. For those of you who are not familiar with the lingo, that is mergers and acquisitions. We've had a variety of different guests, and if you're just tuning in and this is your first listen, you're going to love it. And then I hope you lean in for more. Today, I'm celebrating Maurissa Bell. Maurissa Bell is part of Clairvest, a private equity fund dedicating to helping entrepreneurs achieve their vision through investing in minority capital alongside founders to help build strategically significant business. Maurissa particularly has a passion around women's healthcare, which is another thing we just got to talking about and are aligned with. Maurissa has a varied background, and you don't want me to really sit here and read about Maurissa. I know you want to be talking with her. So Maurissa, thank you for joining me today on Her Success Story.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So share, how did PE, private equity, mergers and acquisitions, how did this become your world?
You know, it's a really interesting space, and there's a lot of misnomers about private equity, which I'm sure you'll ask me about at some point.
It's definitely on my list, I have to tell you, because I know that I hear so many misnomers around it. But what drove you to build a career in this space? Because we don't necessarily see a lot of women leaders here.
Yeah, for sure. It's honestly, it's one of the coolest jobs in the world, in my humble opinion. Every day I have the opportunity to really learn, grow, and develop in so many ways, from learning about new industries and sectors, everything from nuclear waste to GI practices to online rummy to laundry equipment, to really developing a greater understanding of different cultural practices, business norms through investments in other countries, or perhaps areas I haven't been. And I'd say even on top of that, just having the ability to work with so many talented and tenacious individuals is quite a privilege. Founders happen to be one of the most fascinating people or types of people that you can meet. And it's really great to be able to use my knowledge to help their company. So I guess to give you a little bit of background, I grew up in an entrepreneurial household. My dad owned a number of manufacturing companies. And so I saw firsthand what the ups and downs of owning a business really looks like. And, you know,
it's amazing. I have to say, as a kid, because I also came up through an entrepreneurial family, you know, the conversations at the dinner table, I never realized were different than the conversations at my girlfriend's dinner tables until you experience it.
You do. You're like, so do we have a house this month? I'm not really sure how that's going to work. Or alternatively, it's like, oh, we're going on these really nice vacations. Where did that come from? So it certainly has its volatility, especially when you know, you perhaps don't have a partner that's been through it before. And that's really what private equity is, and we'll get into it, but it's a proliferation of best practices, and you'll hear me say that term time and time again, in how to work within a system, within a framework, within an industry to help what you've already alluded to, Ivy, is build strategically significant businesses. That is what we do. And so I get the privilege every day to sit with entrepreneurs, to help them to understand their business, what is their vision, their legacy for the company. And in return, you know, we are there to support them in many, many ways, not just capital, but also in, you know, in a downturn, how do we gain market share? How do we manage through this? Sometimes companies and people mess up. We're all human. So how do we work through that? And you have a partner who's strategic, who understands businesses, who understands governance structures, who understands capital, and has access to a lot of those different structures. So for me, the real, I guess, upbringing into this was my my actual upbringing in terms of wouldn't that be really neat? But I can tell you, I had never in my wildest dreams even heard of private equity or investment banking, where a lot of there are broker dealers for mergers and acquisitions, as you highlighted at the beginning. And so I just came from this humble little town in Thunder Bay, Ontario, where I don't even think I could have told you what a balance sheet was going into university, what a major in finance.
Right. So where was the turning point? So you came from a small town. We went on to university, majored in finance. I know you have your CPA, your CA. So listeners who are not familiar with the United States versus Canada, your accounting degree or your certificate in accounting is your CPA in the United States, and it is your CA in Canada, equal just one less letter.
And to make matters even more complicated, Ivy, is now we also call it the CPA. I'm just old enough that I kept the CA. So,
so what put you on the trajectory then into, there's one thing getting a degree, right? And there's one thing learning about finance. Mm-hmm. And we all college graduates take so many different turns. I have myself, who ever could have predicted where I would end up all these years later. Mm-hmm. But be that as it may, what was your journey that led you to working for Clairvest, a private equity company?
So coming out of university, where I did have a major in finance, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And that's very typical for a lot of individuals coming out with a business degree. Luckily, it had some merit somewhere. And I decided to go into accounting because accounting to me gave me a good base to start with. And I'm forever grateful for that, actually, because when you think back to understanding financial statements, understanding how to construct a financial model, how to think about the internal controls of a business, I learned those all in accounting. And it's a very good base to start with for all of the fundamentals. And so as I worked through my CA or CPA, as you call it, I really got a good understanding or obtained a good understanding of how all of these things work. And I had the potentially, we'll call it privilege for the sake of this podcast, of working with junior mining companies. And so I worked actually out in Vancouver, which for your United States listeners is just above Seattle.
And beautiful. If you've not visited it, it is a beautiful city. And I strongly recommend that on a bucket list.
It is. And I worked out in Vancouver where there's a lot of junior mining companies. And when you don't make money, junior mining companies haven't actually found resources just yet. You have a ton of capital that's required for no revenue. And the way in which you raise that capital is very dependent on the type of investors. And there's a lot of structuring that happens with that. And so I became very interested in how all that worked. I have an affinity for very complex situations, and I really like digging into structuring, understanding how can I solve whatever problem we're trying to solve for. You don't like this? Okay, let's redesign it, reframe it, move it around, figure out what works for you and me. And you do a lot of that with capital structuring. I didn't get the opportunity to do that because I was auditing the companies, but I really, really liked working with them. And so that sort of led me to going into investment banking, where I could work more on a lot of those capital structures, the financing, and it really expands your knowledge base because accounting is very historical. You're reporting what has already happened. Finance or raising capital is on the basis of future. What is going to happen? How do you think about the industry? What is the trajectory? How is the company? What does the management look like? And you're really forecasting that out in order to be able to raise capital. And you're structuring around a lot of, potentially the issues that people can come up with. So I was super excited to go into that. And I moved into Toronto, which is on the East Coast, above New York and, and the like, where I joined an investment bank. And I worked in investment banking and corporate banking, which is debt capital, for over 6 years. And I probably did $25 billion worth of transactions and mergers and acquisitions, debt financing, equity financing, preferred converts, you name it, securitization.
So sounds almost like an accelerated learning trajectory, that experience.
For sure. They say you gain 3 years for every year in investment banking. So by that math, I'm probably 60 today. But it's an expedited.
I'm looking fabulous.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. So yeah, it just became a really fascinating world. For those of you who know investment banking, you do work a lot of hours. That's why it's 3 to 1. But moving on to the buy side, that's what private equity is. You're actually buying the companies. You're no longer a broker. So an investment banker is a broker. Think of like a house. You go to your real estate agent, they help you actually broker the sale from the seller to the buyer.
And I love that example. It's that middle person who assists in the sale, where private equity is actually the buyer of the home, so to speak, or the buyer of the business.
Exactly. That's precisely right. So our whole objective in terms of how private equity works is we go and we raise third-party capital. That can be pension funds, it can be endowment funds, universities, wealthy family offices. Those are the third-party capital. So those are our investors. We go and raise those funds. We then have the job of investing those funds. So we go look for businesses. And as you mentioned, I have an affinity for women's healthcare. So I spend a great deal of time in that space, but I also spend time in other spaces. And so my job is to go buy the house or buy the company, underwrite it, as we call it. And then we work through for the next 5 to 7 years, our proliferation of best practices. So that's effectively putting in place a infrastructure to help the company scale or grow. And that can be through improving the patient care journey. If it's a healthcare business, that can be through mergers and acquisitions. So expanding through buying companies. It can be through what we call de novos, so opening up new clinics. It can be through a many multitude of strategic ways of actually expanding that business over time. So you can think of that like putting renovations into the home. And then in the 5 to 7 years, we sell that business and we realize the profit, which is the difference between what you bought the house for and what you sold the house for.
What a great analogy. Because it is so crystal clear. And because it's so clear, I have to ask you this. Because by analogy purposes, it's like, oh, this is clean, this is neat, this makes a ton of sense. Then why that so often does PE get a bad rap in when you're out there and it's like, oh, you're going to get bought up by PE, and you hear the down in the voice, it's like, well, what do you mean? Isn't that a good thing? I've been at dinner tables where people's like, oh, they just like start firing everyone. I was like, but I work with companies, that's not necessarily true. And so there's companies I work with. I don't want to be the expert because I'm not the expert by any means. So I want to ask you, what is the bad rap about private equity coming into companies, about partnering with private equity? Why does that happen? And then honestly, what's the truth?
Look, it's when you say the words private equity, you or me or anybody else, you're right. It tends to evoke a visceral reaction in either one way or the other. I have seen the other way, where somebody says, oh my gosh, like they're talking about it with admiration, they're excited over the opportunities and the prospect of growth, or it's fear and the thought of absolute destruction, which is what you're talking about with mass layoffs and the like. It's not a dirty word. As I've said, it really sums up a proliferation of best practices. And why do people get so upset about it on that side of the equation? It's really bad actors. In every industry, you have good actors and bad actors. Talk about, doctors. They are great doctors, and there are doctors that skirt the law. You can talk about any form of industry, and there's going to be good and bad. And I think initially where it sort of took legs is if you go back to the 80s when PE actually came into to the evolution of, this is something that is really quite an interesting play, is Barbarians at the Gate. If anybody has ever heard of that book, that is sort of the way a lot of private equity people think about it, which is these big, massive leverage buyouts. So leverage buyout is just putting a bunch of debt on the company to buy it out. And we still do that today, but we do it in a very different way. We're not barbarians at the gates. We're there to build strategically significant businesses alongside our entrepreneur partners. We're there to evoke, as I've said, a proliferation of best practices. At Clairvest specifically, we've created over 6,000 jobs in the last 20 partnerships that we've had.
Wow.
And we're a small
I might jump right
company.
in on you. You're a smaller market company and you created 6,000 jobs
in the last 20 partnerships. Yeah.
That's impressive, I have to say, because when you talk numbers back up fact.
They do. Absolutely. And, I can even add to that by saying we've raised over 15 billion in debt financing for companies. So what that means is we are private equity. Equity is literally just that, equity. Think of your cash. Debt is something that gets put on the business. And
AKA a mortgage for the house.
Correct. Yes, you're picking up on it. You've got it. Exactly. A mortgage for the house. And so what tends to happen with entrepreneurs in the mid-market space, and I'm going to define it as, for us, it's about 5 million profitability to 50 million profitability, is founders or entrepreneurs actually have to give personal guarantees on the debt. So they've remortgaged their house, they've done whatever. We have a number of relationships with banks where we can take that personal guarantee away and we can say, okay, here's actually the financing in addition to our equity check that can effectively help you grow. The whole purpose of it is to take it from a house that you bought for $1 million and sell it for $2 million. Wherever you live, that might be astronomical, but in Toronto, you can't even get half a house for $1 million.
I was going to say, well, in a city these days, like being from Toronto now, I have clients up there and Toronto, New York. Yeah. I mean, we're talking those numbers.
Exactly. So helping get debt financing is critical to business growth. We've assisted with over 360 tuck-in acquisitions. So that again means helping the company with acquisitions. It's not necessarily their area of expertise, but that is our background. And what I would say to that too is that I don't think people realize how big the private markets are. There's about $1 trillion of transactions globally in the private markets. And McKinsey, who's the latest that I've seen, there's a bunch of them that estimate that private equity markets globally, or private markets globally, are 10 to 12 trillion based on assets under management. So it's big.
That's massive.
Private, it's huge.
I had no idea of those numbers.
It's big, and that's private equity and venture capital. So I am adding to it a bit. And the private credit markets, those are a whole other kind of kettle of fish. So it's a really, really, really big market. And companies rely on it substantially, especially when the public markets are not in play. Right now, we're in a bit of what I would call purgatory, where everybody's sort of waiting for the markets to reemerge. Public markets are not as accessible right now to the same degree as they typically are. You haven't seen any IPOs, initial public offerings for your viewers or listeners, since you can't see me. And so the private markets pick up there where the public markets might fall down. And it's really about the ability to continue to ensure that liquidity and capital remains in the market to help expand not only companies, but economies as well. So we contribute to economic expansion. Now, you might say, well, we're going into a recession, Maurissa, and of course we can debate that fact too. That said, companies need capital even more.
Right. And I love that this is so you brought out that R word that I also take exception to a little bit, and no, we're not going into this whole discussion, listeners, about is there or is there not a recession. What I will say is any business that has longevity is going to go through a variety of strong and weaker economic markets. And great leaders are always looking for opportunity in all markets. Where is the opportunity? Having great partners, right, which is what Maurissa's talking about, gives you capital and gives you brain power. When you're dealing with a partnership within the private equity space or a venture capital space, where they're involved in a variety of businesses, they're seeing things. And this is what I admire about it. And this is honestly why I started Listeners. So you say, why did I decide to do a series on private equity and mergers and acquisitions? Because honestly, whenever something, God's honest truth, pisses me off, I have to explore it. And I was hearing a lot of things that got me annoyed. So I said, we're going to actually get truth in interviews and true stories and real people and real conversations. Yet in my personal belief is great leadership and great business decisions are not always made alone. It's about brain power from a variety of perspectives. And private equity space gives you the ability to have partnerships with people who have brain power in a variety of different industries that gains business knowledge and business perspective, and then helps leaders, CEOs, and the C-suite make great decisions in any economic marketplace.
For sure. I would agree with that. I think that there's a benefit to having a partner, and it's not just the brain power that you allude to, it's also the resources and the relationships. Yes. And I don't mean resources in the terms of capital, though that does come in handy when you're stuck, but mostly in the relationships that we have and the access to people, places and things that, we've built over decades. Our private equity fund, so Clairvest, was incepted over 30 years ago, which doesn't seem that long, but for a private equity fund is actually quite old. A lot of funds don't last over 2 fund cycles. So a fund cycle is probably about 10 years before they've sort of realized that it's not going to work. We were about to raise our 7th fund. So we're on our 6th fund now. We raised $850 million US to invest in predominantly minority capital into North America. And the vast majority of our investments are in the US. So that's, I'd say, almost 80% of it. So I spend a lot of time on a plane. I have a frequent flyer status, which I'm ashamed of. But
I don't know. I'm just going to call a spade a spade. I told you today's a travel day for me, and boarding a plane at a little after 6 this morning, that frequent flyer status came in very nice, as well as the club, the club for a cup of coffee beforehand. Just saying.
Yeah. I try not to get used to those things, but yes. Sorry, go ahead.
So, I want to ask you. One thing you just said resonates with me and is to me such an important piece of business. And that's the value of relationship building, of always relationship building. It was interesting. I guest spoke a couple of nights ago at actually Columbia Business School, a class on entrepreneurship. And they brought in, and it was myself and another gentleman, and he started talking about, if you're looking to raise capital, look at your relationships. And then I said, when I came up to speak, I said, Bruce and I met about 30 seconds ago. I said, yet a large part of my last book was about authentic relationships and business building, and the consistency and I think consistency is the word, and the openness to always being connecting to relationships. And that's the golden resource, as you're saying. When we talk resources, yes, capital is a great resource, but the greatest resource we can get our hands on are the connections, which are through the relationships we build and our partners and the relationships that they build, and always staying abreast of that and always being consistent on working and developing it.
Yes, just yes. Correct. I think I don't want to say we're expert relationship builders, but we sort of have to be, in the sense that you're building a relationship with a partner. When you don't, and I didn't talk about this, but there are different types of private equity funds. There's buyout funds and growth funds, and they literally are exactly as their name suggests. Growth funds are for growth capital, and buyout funds are to buy out the company. We don't buy out companies, change management. That's not our playbook. We partner with entrepreneurs and provide growth capital. Why does that have anything to do with relationships? Because when you own less than 50% of a business, you need to play nice in the sandbox. You need to build a relationship with that person. That has taken, probably for the vast majority of our investments, sometimes 2 to 3 years to build that relationship before somebody trusts us enough to say, yes, you can come into my house. We will share this home. You will own 40% of it. I will own 60. And so that's a big exercise in trust building. And it's also, then you can't get into the business and just destroy it. It's not going to serve you or anybody else. So there's a lot of, and we spend a great deal of time on this, especially even at our own company, instilling those types of values into people. And that's, that we approach a process with integrity. We approach it with respect. And look, everyone will say the same things, but we are open-minded. We are, long-term thinkers. And as a result, we actually do hold our companies much longer than a lot of other private equity funds. And that's important, because part of the relationship with the founder or the entrepreneur is also in when you go to sell it. If they don't want to sell it, let's just be very clear. When you put them in front of new investors, they're going to say, terrible business, don't buy it. So you have to get them on the same page, and vice versa. We don't want to sell in a down market or a bad market. And you're actually seeing a lot of that right now. So that whole relationship and thinking long-term and having those value sets are super critical. And when we think about the people that we invest with, we also expect them to think the same of us. Do we share values? Because at the end of the day, we are getting married and we are moving into this house together, and it's going to be a long 7 years if we don't get along. So date a little bit, figure out whether you like each other, and whether you share those common sets of values. And I would say our CEO is, tone at the top. He embodies all of these values, and he instills them greatly in us, such that we have, to give you an example of why these matter, we are investing for the 3rd time with the same person. That never happens. So I'm just going to say, business,
wow,
sold it, bought a new one with them, sold it, and currently have one.
So you have 3 children together in the marriage.
Correct. Absolutely correct. So but that's a testament to the relationships that you build with people, that they want to come back and work with you. So I struggle when people say, oh, private equity, they just screw you over. It's like, well, then why'd you come back?
So as we close today, we said something early on about we don't see a lot of women in leadership in this space. If we can give one tip to our listeners out there, what might it be? I just put you on the spot.
That's okay. I like being put on the spot. I think generally this industry does not attract a ton of women, in part because of I'm not saying women don't work hard, but the hours are long. And I would say just generally, there's not a ton of women already, which makes it a little bit more difficult to see yourself in an environment where there are no women. Hopefully I can change that just a little bit. But my advice is really to just do something that you're passionate about and find people who want to do it with you. And if that's private equity, there are women. We do exist. We are trying. And I think that that's really important to sync up with them. One of the things we didn't get a chance to really talk about is sort of, why I'm here. And in part, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard this, is I am a product of those whose shoulders I stand on, meaning I've had great mentors. And I mean that forever and a day. I would not be who I am, where I am, what I am without them. That doesn't mean I didn't do the hard work, but I had somebody that believed in me enough to say, you're not doing it right. And if you want X, you have to change the way you do it. I'm not saying women need to change. What I'm saying is we need people to explain to us how it works and support us. And the mentors that you find will do that. And if you can find women in the space, I'm happy to be one of them. Then I think that makes it a lot easier.
And I agree with you 1,000%. Listeners, if you don't have a mentor, think about it. Think about what you could be doing for yourself. I've been in the business world. I've owned a business for over 30 years, one of two companies over the time. And I've always believed, and to this day, have people that are mentors to me, people that I talk to things about, talk things through with, people who I look for guidance. It doesn't mean we're not smart, because we're all pretty damn smart, but it helps us see and bring out the best of our ability and shine and run with it. And that's seeing it from somebody else's point of view.
It's true. And I would even add to that, one of the things that I was not good at when I was younger, which speaks to this, is if you ask somebody a question, they will give you an answer. So be wary of who you ask the question of. You wouldn't ask a veterinarian for an opinion on whether you need to get your wisdom tooth out. So why would you ask somebody who has never been where you want to go how to get there?
Touché. Well, listeners, that is an awesome tip. Maurissa, thank you so much for joining me here today on Her Success Story.
My pleasure. It was lovely to speak with you, and I'm happy to be here.
And listeners, this is the point in the show that I say pretty much the same thing every time. So for the newer group of listeners, you might want to pay attention. For the old listeners, you know what to do. Think about this interview for a moment and say, what did you take away from it? What is that aha moment for you? Give yourself the gift of writing it down. You could put it in the show notes. You could put it in your phone, your computer, a little piece of paper, and say, from that takeaway, from that aha, what are you going to do for your career, your life, and business that makes this last 30 minutes worthwhile in your life? Thank you for joining me here today on Her Success Story. And thank you for tuning in to this series on mergers and acquisitions, M&A, PE, and maybe even a little venture capital. Stay tuned and let us know what you think.
Don't need your approval anymore, 'cause I've got my